Good morning, everybody. I'm Leah Gazan, and I'm the Member of Parliament from Winnipeg Centre, and we're here to discuss support of Bill C-413 to amend the criminal code to include the willful promotion of hate against Indigenous peoples by condoning, downplaying, justifying the residential schools. But before we begin, we have a short video presentation that was put together by the Office of the Special Interlocutor of survivors at the 6th National Gathering. And if you'd like to see the full video, you can see it online on the website of the Special Interlocutor. So with that, we'll start the video.
The children have been taken from us, and we want them back to make the world safe for the children we now have and the ones that are coming.
It is so impactful and hurtful to think of children who would be given such disrespect in life and in death.
We had a distinct way to honor the people who left us. There were ceremonies, there were songs, and for the children at our schools that are in unmarked burials, they have yet to receive this.
My mom attended residential school in Beauval Mission, La Planche. I'm the youngest of 11 children. The 2 oldest babies passed away. In her dying bed, my mother said, "Please look for him."
It's time for Canada as a whole to see this uncomfortable truth for what it is. It's time for them to feel it, see it, sit with those unsettling feelings, and learn from it so it does not happen again. No more denying what our survivors have been saying for years. No more belittling what it was, because it was genocide.
Very much. And there is a number if you need assistance on the screen, if you need to call anybody. As I know that this is a very difficult topic and very triggering for many individuals. It's my honor to be joined today by Special Interlocutor Kimberly Murray, survivors Donna DeBasque from the Wemicon Nation, Barb LaValle from Cowsis, in Saskatchewan, and Doug George from Akasasani, just next to Ottawa, on unceded Algonquin territory. I want to thank the survivors today. This is about them. This is about lifting up the voices of survivors, families, and communities to ensure that they are protected from violence, further incitement of hate crimes after enduring what happened in residential schools. Survivors, families, and communities have a right to be safe from violence, safe from hate, and that's exactly what Bill C-413 to amend the Criminal Code 319 to add to the Criminal Code, in addition to Holocaust denial, the willful promotion of hate against Indigenous people by condoning, downplaying, justifying the residential schools. With that, it's my very great honor to invite to the stage Special Interlocutor Kimberly Murray to talk a little bit about her support for Bill C-14 and to encourage the government. We now have a report. The report has echoed what is outlined in Bill C-413 to do justice, to meet their obligations to survivors and make sure that this becomes law. And without further ado, I'd like to invite to the stage Special Interlocutor Kimberly Murray.
Sego, Seguego, Kimberly Murray, Ni Negana Sitage. In my final report that I released earlier this week, I noted that despite the well-documented reality that thousands of Indigenous children died at Indian residential schools, and that many children are buried in unmarked and mass graves, some Canadians have mounted a concerted effort to attack the truths of survivors, Indigenous families, and communities. And they are inciting hate towards them by claiming that there are no missing and disappeared children and no unmarked or mass graves in this country. These attacks are an attack on the memory of the lost ones, are hateful, and a continuation of the genocidal process against Indigenous people. Denial of the truth about the harms of Indian residential schools has a profound impact on survivors, their families, and communities. To be heard and believed and to have the truth be visible and acknowledged is a fundamental right and a prerequisite to healing. Denialists deny facts, attack the credibility of victims, and portray victims as oppressive perpetrators while characterizing themselves as the victims. This re-victimizes those who have already suffered and incites hate against Indigenous peoples. The goal is to maintain settler impunity and to protect perpetrators and deny the genocide committed against Indigenous people. Obligation 37 of the 42 obligations identified in my final report is that the federal government must amend the criminal code, making it an offense to willfully promote hatred against Indigenous people by condoning, denying, downplaying, or justifying the Indian residential school system, or by misrepresenting facts relating to it. Implementing this obligation would be consistent with Canada's commitments under the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Canada has a responsibility to uphold Article 15 of the Declaration, an declaration that enshrines Indigenous peoples' right to dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and requires states to take effective measures to combat prejudice and eliminate discrimination and to promote tolerance, understanding, and good relations between Indigenous people and all other segments of society. I'm here today to support Bill C-413 and urge the government to pass the bill to put a stop to the hatred against survivors, their families, and communities, and to protect and honor the memory of the victims and the survivors of Indian residential schools, and to send a message that Canada is committed to upholding human rights and rejects the spread of hatred in this country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Special Interlocutor Kimberly Murray, for your support, your hard work over the last 2 years. It was hard work, and I commend you for your work, and thank you for supporting the bill. I now would like to call up survivor Donna DeBasque from the Wickwemicon First Nation to share her thoughts about the bill and her voice and words. Donna?
Miigwech. Pusho, bevde kwedang eninde gon shabe kwendao gi gondo demawe. Pshikegi ningenot magna. Mikam kongini benja jimne domnesing. Carbonation kadigini odeabjikobnigon. So at this time I've introduced myself as my English name is Donna DeBasque. I'm a residential school student former student from the Spanish Indian Residential School for Girls, where I attended for 5 years. My number was 2. When I hear people say that the residential school was a good thing and that nothing bad happened there, it upsets me. It is hurtful to think that people don't believe the truths of survivors. We are the living witnesses. We know what happened in those institutions. You know, we lived there. They need to erase us they wanted to erase us, take away our culture, separate us from our families and our communities and our lands. It was genocide. And when people purposely deny that happened when someone is purposely denying that happened to me, it causes me great pain. Miigwech.
I'd now like to call to the stage Barb Lavalley from Cowsas First Nation in Saskatchewan. And I just want to thank you, Donna, for your courage and for sharing with us today. Thank you. If you need water, there's water there.
Thank you. I'm Barb Lavalley. I am from Cowsas First Nation and have been a part of the Piapot community for 40 years. I did attend Qu'Appelle Indian Residential School. My career is with the research, the scientific analysis of the unmarked burials and in search of the truth. When it's denied by Canada or its citizens that these burials are not real, we're using Western science to factualize that so that we could never experience the trauma of denialism. We're here as the voice of our ancestors. I'm a third generational IRS survivor, and we're their voice. We're the voice of our ancestors in search of the truth for them. For those that didn't make it home, we'll find you. We help them, the families, the ones that did come through. They seen what happened, and we'll always be there for their support. Canada needs to end the denialism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna, for your voice and your words. We've heard from two survivors the impact, the violence that continues to be perpetuated against survivors, and this must end. The report has come out, and this must end. With that, I'd like to invite Doug George from Akwesasne to come up and say a few words. Thank you, Doug. And there's water here, Doug, if you want.
All right.
Okay.
My name is Doug George, Mohawk named Ganadio from the Mohawk community of Akwesasne, and my number at the Mohawk Institute, perhaps the worst of all residential schools in Canada, is 482-738. That was part of the dehumanization process that we were subjected to from the first time we entered the doors of that institute. What amazes me is throughout this process of trying to locate the burial sites of those thousands of missing Native children is the resilience of Native people. I don't know how many Canadians realize that Aboriginal people 100 years ago were on the point of physical extinction, that there were just over 100,000 Native people across Canada. In the U.S., 250,000. So when people said that we were the vanishing Americans, they were absolutely right. By all logic, we should have disappeared, but we didn't. And in an odd way, the 150,000 Native children that were taken from their homes and kidnapped and placed in these institutions managed to endure, to survive. And their voices, while muted for many years, in the past few years, the spirits of those children have shown us that they still have power. Even though they are interred in these grave sites, they're still with us. They're speaking through us, even here, even now. And when I returned back to the Mohawk Institute after being away for many, many years, we told the children that it was our responsibility to give them voice, to locate them, and to repatriate them back to the embrace of Mother Earth in their respective communities. And that's the enormous task before us. We've seen how Canadians have reacted to the finding of those 200-plus burial sites in British Columbia. Now, you can imagine the wave of emotion that's about to overwhelm Canada when these other sites are found, including the Mohawk Institute. So we anticipate, based upon our primary research, that there's going to be hundreds of children that will be found just from my community alone. But that's the extent to which we've been actively and physically oppressed. And that's, again, how close we came to actual physical extinction. And we don't need denialism. What we do need is to embrace this part of our collective heritage for everyone that was born in this country, to acknowledge that and to engage in active activities that will bring peace and resolution to the children. And that's what we're here for, to say that no one, no entity, no individual has the right to silence and muzzle the voices of those children. And through this legislation, we give those children meaningful voice. So thank you.
So thank you so much, Doug, for sharing. This is about the truth. This is about building a better country for everybody. And we cannot reconcile in this country if there's still a denial of the truth. If the very folks, survivors that shared their stories, continue to be abused in this country, there will be no reconciliation. Now, the Prime Minister said his most important relationship when he was first elected in 2015 was that with Indigenous people. So I am calling on the Liberal government to support this bill if they are truly honest about being committed to reconciling in this country. It must first start with protecting survivors. With that, I'll open the stage for questions.
Yeah, with the Canadian Press, we've asked the Prime Minister if he supports the bill. He mentioned that it's a difficult balance when you're putting limits on what he said free speech. We've asked Varani what he would do. He hasn't given us a firm answer. I asked the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister again yesterday. No firm answer. What does it say that your bill was introduced about a month ago now and there's still no decision from the Liberals as to whether or not this is something that they would adopt?
Well, I'd encourage the Prime Minister to read the criminal code. Inciting hate against a group of people is not free speech. There is a difference between free speech and inciting hate. Residential school denialism is inciting hate, full stop. Survivors deserve protection. They have a right to be safe from violence, as all other people across Canada have a right to be safe from violence. If the Prime Minister, if the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations and the Justice Minister are serious about reconciling in this country, survivors, families, and communities need protection. And I urge them and encourage them to read the bill and give quick support to the bill.
And my next question is for Kimberly Murray. Your report also talks about the Online Harms Act, and the chapter includes some emails that were sent to your office directly. Have you heard from the Liberals as to whether or not they would even be considering adding residential schools as a provision under?
I have not heard from the government in relation to that obligation. In fairness, they only received my obligations on Tuesday, but I think it's really important to include Indian residential schools into that bill. As you can see, the emails that have been targeted towards me and also to Indigenous communities and the teams that are doing these ground searches are very troubling, and we also have to put a stop to that.
And would you both be able to perhaps give us an example as to what would be covered under the Residential School Denialism Bill or the provisions under the Online Harms Act? Like, what do you see denialism being, and what do you think could be prosecuted under that?
Well, I mean, in terms of prosecution, we know with the provision in the criminal code surrounding Holocaust denial, it hasn't been tested in the courts. It'll be up to the courts to decide whether they keep the provision throughout the provision and what kind of consequences they decide for the incitement of hate. But as we've said, it's about the willful condoning or of Indigenous hate by condoning, downplaying, denying, or justifying what happened in the residential school. It's not about people talking around the kitchen table, but I would point to you folks like Tom Flanagan, doing willful mass promotion of disinformation, of facts around well-documented historical facts with his book, or an example of that. Mass dissemination of hate. Survivors, families, and communities have a right to be free of violence as all other people living across Canada. If this government is serious about ending hate in this country, if this government is serious about reconciling in this country, it must first start with protecting survivors, families, and communities.
Gazan, how would you characterize your conversations with the federal government about your bill, and have you spoken to opposition parties as well to try to get their support?
Well, I know that the Conservative Party has indicated, Jamie Schmiel, is that they're looking at it. Let's be clear, however, they have met and fundraised with residential school denying think tanks like the Frontier Centre. It's unacceptable to me. I have talked to the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. I know he's said in the media that he's supportive of the bill. Special Interlocutor Kimberly Murray, survivors once again were expected to tell stories. Why? To help us reconcile in this country. Is this going to be another example like the TRC where survivors our stories are used and the government fails to act? They failed to act on most of the calls to action of the TRC. Are they now going to fail to act on the obligations that have come out of the report of the Special Interlocutor? I'm calling them on it. They have to stop abusing abusing survivors, abusing the stories of survivors, and act to put in place the obligations that are outlined in the report that's coming out from the Special Interlocutor. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I have a follow-up for Kimberly Murray. It's related to this topic, but not directly. Do you think the Prime Minister should explicitly accept your finding that children who died at residential schools were victims of the crime against humanity of enforced disappearance? And what do you think would be the implications of him making that acceptance?
Yes, absolutely. In my final report, I talk about how our current apologies and acknowledgements in this country don't go far enough. They don't acknowledge and accept the complete harms and the crimes against humanity that were committed against Indigenous children in Indian residential schools. We need to recognize as a country that these crimes happened. And if I had my slide, I'd put it up right now that identifies the list of crimes against humanity: murder, forced sterilization, enforced disappearances, just to name a few. Every crime in the Crimes Against Humanity Act happened in Indian residential schools. There's no denying that. The TRC's evidence is clear. The historical records are clear. The voices of our living victims, our witnesses, are clear. And so absolutely, we need to recognize that crimes against humanity happened. And so what does that mean? It triggers obligations. It triggers obligations on this country to provide proper reparations. And proper reparations include passing legislation, like the bill that's before that MP Leah Gazan has put forward. It's part of a reparations practice, policy under the UN Declaration and Indigenous laws and international law.
And what else do you have on the table, or what would be the next steps if the government decides not to recognize that these were crimes against humanity? What would happen in that case?
Well, there's some avenues that Indigenous people can pursue in the international forum. As I said at my closing, it's really important that we get the Working Group Against Enforced Disappearances to come do a country visit in Canada and look at the issue of the unmarked burials and enforced disappearances and issue a report to identify the failures of this country in upholding its obligations under international law.
And Kimberly Murray, do you think you can just give us a brief summary of just the amount of searches that are going on across the country, maybe some of the key findings so far, and how long this may take?
Well, as you know, I called for a commission of investigation into enforced disappearances with a 20-year mandate, with powers to compel records and powers to access sites, something that my office didn't have and the TRC didn't have. There are over, the last I looked at the funding that was provided to me from the list of communities funded, there were over 160 communities that were being funded. And as I've said to the government, we can't continue to treat the search for disappeared children as a government program. This is an obligation that the state has as part of the reparation process. It will take years, and we have experts on the stage that have done the searches and are doing the searches at the residential schools that they were taken to. And it's a very long process. Getting into the archives, doing the ground searches, analyzing the data, and consulting with survivors and other communities that had their children taken to those institutions. But the 20-year mandate that I've identified is because we know it's more than the Indian residential schools. It's all these other institutions where children were taken. Indian hospitals, mental health asylums, TB sanatorium. And I believe that a commission of investigation into forced disappearances of Indigenous children at these institutions need to be investigated as well by that commission.
We will now take a question on Zoom. Nous allons maintenant prendre une question sur Zoom. Hélène, la parole est à vous.
Yes, my question is for MP Gazan. Yes, I'd like to know what you would say to those who say there is a risk with your bill of criminalizing speech. Examples, would this bill, would saying that many of these kids die of Spanish flu be considered criminal downplaying? Would saying that education was made compulsory for all other Canadian kids at the time be considered criminal justification? What do you say to that?
Well, let me be really clear. The historical record is clear. The purpose of residential schools was to kill the Indian in the child. No school should have grave sites around it. I don't know any public schools across the country that have grave sites around it. So let me be clear about that. And again, I go back. There's a difference between inciting hate and free speech. Hate speech is not free speech. This is clearly outlined in the criminal code. The incitement of hate against Indigenous people, especially survivors whose stories have gifted us with stories in an attempt to rebuild a country of human rights and justice, deserve to be free of violence. Families, communities, survivors have a right to be free from violence, as all other people living across Canada, and that is exactly what the bill is designed to do.
Yeah, but you're not exactly answering my question. I get back to the Spanish flu numbers. The Truth and Reconciliation has an entire chapter about graves and mentions some data about Spanish flu. So I'm just, again, asking, would bringing up that fact be now considered criminal downplaying with your bill?
Let me be clear, as I've said before, that's up to the courts to decide, courts and judges to decide. This provision has not been tested in the courts. Courts can decide whether they're going to uphold the provision, throw the provision out, and what kind of consequences and what they determine to be denialism. Let me be clear, however, we have survivors, a living historical record, who are being denied about what they have seen with their very own eyes. I can't think of anything more violent than to deny the story of somebody's genocide. And there's a clear intent. There's a clear intent to perpetuate the privilege and the power of the state that has been born on the genocide of Indigenous peoples in this country. This needs to stop. The incitement of hate against Indigenous peoples needs to stop. And this government, if it's serious about reconciling with Indigenous peoples, needs to ensure that at the very least, survivors and intergenerational survivors who have endured the most unimaginable violence and genocide are free of violence in Canada.
Survivors. Obviously, you wouldn't be here if you weren't in support of the legislation, but I'm wondering if you can all speak to why you are in support of it and kind of what your experiences with denialism specifically have been.
As research for several IRS sites, the denialism, we were told face to face, don't drag these good priests, these good men through this. Don't drag don't dirty their names. There were emails, phone calls, and inquiries, even from the Indigenous community, the staunch Catholicism that's out there. It's traumatic. It's very, very hard to live in what we're doing, the research, and then have the government not support the reality, the truths, the experiences of our survivors, the oral history and the intergenerational. We need to support their truths.
There's water here. Miigwech, for the question. I guess my response to that would be one just needs to look in the communities to see what has happened to many of us, many of our families. And, you see it in the hospitals, or the people that are, sick with, we have high rates of diabetes because of stress. We have, our people fill up our courtrooms because, they're having a hard time coping. So many instances where people have, we can see obviously the impacts to our next generation, second, third generation, even today, that we haven't healed, and we need to do the healing, and we need to do people need to accept our stories, and that'll give us, the, I'm not sure what the word would be, but to confirm that and validate what happened to us, and that this is absolutely, a detriment to how our communities are surviving these days. Miigwech.
Well, our feeling amongst Mohawk people is that when you say that these things did not happen or didn't happen to the extent that they did, is to challenge the very fabric of this country and truth itself. And that we feel it's a concerted initiative by people to try to qualify the responsibility of not only the federal government, but of Canadian citizens as a whole, as to the horrors of what happened inside those schools. When we think about reconciliation, our first responsibility is to reconcile with the children that were left at these places of confinement. And when you talk about education and how people bring that up, none of the schools were designed to educate or enhance the intellectual lives of the children. They were all meant to qualify, to destroy our self-identity, and to serve as a channel into menial labor. When I was at the Mohawk Institute, there was no encouragement for us to actually learn. It was oppression, overt and done without any thought towards responsibility on the part of those people who were in positions of supervision for the children. And so what we need is rules like this that compel the federal government to take the lead, as it should, to define how Canada will react to these stories. And some Canadians might be, maybe feeling as though it's been a bit overwhelming over the past years, but you can imagine what it's like for us, or our children, or our communities. And this isn't pleasant to say that we're going to physically dig up children and bring their remains back to the surface. But we are adopting contemporary technologies and a determined cause of death. The Spanish flu thing came up. That was in 1919, but there were thousands of children that died in these schools. And what we found is that many instances of death were attributed to things like influenza and other communicable diseases, when in fact it was specific acts of violence that were meant to obscure this. And during my tenure, my stay at the Mohawk Institute, I can tell you this, that not once, to my knowledge, that any of the children ever have access to adequate medical care. And that when a child did pass on, again, it was hidden and obscured, and the burials were in the back of the school. So we're trying hard to bring justice to those children. And when people say that didn't happen, then I challenge them, come to the Mohawk Institute, which is still standing, walk with us through the grounds, and listen to the children as they run up and down those stairs trying to escape their abusers. That's the reality of the Mohawk Institute. So it still resonates. So you can't hide behind these things. You've got to come to grips with it. And remember, these are children.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference. Merci, c'est ce qui conclut la conférence.